This is Dateline News and Conversation. Well, the topic tonight is Israel. It's 3 months now that they have been raiding and bombing Gaza. They've killed, I think, somewhere over 20,000 innocent civilians, most of them children. My guest tonight, he's returning, Dimitri Lascaris. He's an attorney, he's an activist, he's a journalist. He's been covering this issue for quite some time. He's been to Gaza, he's been in the region several times, and he's presently coming to us from Washington, D.C., where he attended a massive rally yesterday in Washington with people that came from all over the country. Dimitri, welcome back to the show.
Good to see you again, Regis. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Dimitri, I need to know and completely understand, what is the significance of South Africa bringing this case, this accusation of genocide against Israel, to the International Court of Justice? Can you explain two things: significance of Africa, and then what kind of authority does this International Court of Justice really have?
So, the identity of the state that seeks enforcement of the Genocide Convention, I guess in one sense shouldn't matter, because ultimately an application of the kind that South Africa has bought is really about the conduct of the state against which the accusation is leveled. And in that case, of course, that's Israel. But one cannot escape the historical and moral significance and political significance of this being South Africa, which I think is enormous. I mean, obviously, we all know South Africa, after decades of brutal colonial oppression and its Black population having to endure an apartheid regime, which was widely supported by the West, succeeded in throwing off the yoke of racist oppression without really much violence at the end of the day. It's quite surprising how relatively peaceful the transition was to a democratic, or at least a much more democratic government than had preceded the one now in power. It's also a member of the BRICS, a founding member of the BRICS, which I think is significant, and it's a very important state from the global South. But it's primarily the fact that it was a victim of apartheid, and it's historic. It's heroic. Leaders of the anti-apartheid movement, most notably Nelson Mandela, established so much admiration and respect around the world, including in the West. So I've described South Africa's appearance before the ICJ as that of a heavyweight. It's a heavyweight fighter in this battle. And it will be taken seriously, and its voice will have particular weight, I think, with the judges, particularly those from the global South, and a good number of the judges are from the global South. And it's much harder also outside of the courtroom for Israel to discredit South Africa. I mean, if this were a predominantly Arab or Muslim country, Israel would say they're biased. They're like all Arabs and Muslims. They hate us. They hate the Jewish people. They're inherently evil, because that is essentially what the Netanyahu government says about Arabs and Muslims. But it's much harder for them to make this case against South Africa. The other thing that's quite interesting about this is that Israel's government, this is before obviously Netanyahu's time as prime minister of Israel, was quite close to the Afrikaner regime, the apartheid regime in South Africa, politically, militarily, economically. And so, I mean, I wouldn't call this payback. I don't think this is payback at all, because I think ultimately South Africa's government is motivated overwhelmingly by its profound concern for the Palestinian people. It has been very consistent in that regard. But there's a certain element of karma here, Regis. I mean, if anybody, has reason to be aggrieved outside of the historic Palestine, if anybody has reason to be aggrieved with the conduct of Israel over the decades of its existence, it's the people of South Africa, frankly, the black people of South Africa. So all of this, I think, means that it's going to be even harder for the ICJ to dismiss the application. But ultimately, this is going to come down principally, assuming that they are acting in accordance with their responsibilities and are not being influenced by pressure being applied by the United States, other Western states, and Israel behind the scenes or publicly. This should come down to the facts relating to Israel's behavior in Gaza. And it should be entirely driven by that and the law, the application of the law. And people need to understand one other thing I think about this application. I've talked about this repeatedly. Others with expertise in international law have been talking about it, but I don't think it's widely understood by the public. This is not the final determination about as to whether Israel is committing genocide. That's going to take years to litigate. And will be subjected to a higher standard of proof, effectively the criminal standard proof, which is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, a very high threshold to meet. What this hearing was about last week was a request by South Africa for urgent provisional or preliminary measures ordered by the ICJ to prevent genocide from occurring or being consummated. And in order for for South Africa to obtain the relief it's requesting, it doesn't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Israel is committing genocide. It just has to prove that it's plausible, that it's one of potentially several plausible interpretations of its conduct. That's a much lower standard to meet. And from my perspective, because that is the applicable standard, and given the evidence that's available, this is an absolute slam dunk. And it would be, and I'm not the only person, not the only lawyer out there who's saying this, it would be astonishing and scandalous if the International Court of Justice did not give to South Africa essentially the relief that it's requesting.
Okay. I have to ask you a couple of questions. First of all, I have read in a couple of different places that the ICJ is really heavily influenced by the United States and the United Nations. And the United Nations really has been under the jackboot of the United States probably since its inception. What can you add to that?
Well, I don't think I would answer your question by saying that I think over time the situation has evolved. The level of I think over time the institutions of the United Nations, their independence has in fact declined. But and I'll come back to your question briefly. I just want to point out, because it's particularly pertinent to Israel, in that in 2004, this court, not these judges, they weren't on the bench at the time, but this court rendered a unanimous decision that Israel's settlements in the West Bank violate the Fourth Geneva Convention. Which is a pretty serious, allegation. And it was an advisory opinion, and Israel didn't appear. It has done so this time, but it didn't appear to defend itself, which was its longstanding practice at that time. But even the American judge on that court agreed that Israel's settlements were a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. So if that's any guide to go by, people should be optimistic, those who want to see justice done for the Palestinian people. But as I said at the outset of it, my answer to your question, the level of independence of the institutions of the United Nations, I think, have declined over the years in the last 20 years or so. And frankly, I think the behavior during this genocide of the UN Secretary General Guterres is a perfect example of that. You look at the way he responded, for example, to the language he employed in responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and compare it to the language that he's employed to compare in talking about the astonishing depravity and savagery that Israel has exhibited during the last 3 months, including killing well over 100 staffers of the United Nations Relief Works Agency. My understanding is this has been the deadliest conflict the past 3 months in the history of that important arm of the United Nations. Israel has repeatedly attacked United Nations schools where displaced persons were being sheltered in Gaza. It is basically and insulted the United Nations. Accused it of anti-Semitism. At one point where I think the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations over the last 3 months was wearing a big yellow star, to accuse the entire organization of being profoundly anti-Semitic and associating it with the Nazi regime effectively. And yet, you haven't seen that kind of language, the kind of language we saw from Guterres in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Just point out the hypocrisy of this. According to, I believe it was the UN, the number of civilian casualties in the Ukraine war just passed barely over 10,000. Of course, that's a lot of people. And it's tragic that many civilians have died, but it was a little in excess of 10,000 as of November of last year. So that was about 21 months after the invasion began in February 2022. And as you indicated at the outset, the level of civilian casualties in Gaza after 3 months is in the range of 24,000. Okay, the number of children who were killed in Ukraine after 18 months was, according to Save the Children, 540. The number of children killed in Gaza after 3 months was over 12,000. And let's bear in mind that not all the children and civilians killed in Ukraine were killed by munitions fired by Russian forces. Undoubtedly, a substantial proportion of them were killed by the very voluminous munitions that were fired by Ukrainian forces. And I don't know, I'm not suggesting that any of these killings were intentional. I don't have evidence of, to make that determination. But certainly, whatever number of civilians have died and children have died in the war in Ukraine, some portion of them were killed intentionally or not intentionally by Ukrainian forces. So if you're going to behave in a principled manner, and you're the Secretary General of the United Nations, you should be employing far harsher language with respect to what Israel is doing in Gaza than with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So at the end of the day, what's going to happen? I mean, I still think that this court is going to rule against Israel. And the main reason why I believe that, it's not that I'm inspired with confidence in the institutions of the United Nations nowadays. I'm not. But a very important fact that non-lawyers haven't talked about in the commentary about what the ICJ is likely to do is that in 2020, the ICJ was asked for essentially the same relief in a case involving Myanmar. And the applicant in that case was Gambia. It granted the relief in question, or that was being sought, even though the evidence was not as compelling as the evidence here. It was, quite troubling, the evidence, but it was not as compelling as the evidence here. So you didn't have, for example, Myanmar officials. I've read the decision, by the way, the Myanmar decision in full. I did that just before the ICJ hearing started. And you didn't have the kind of openly and audaciously genocidal statements coming out of multiple leaders of the Myanmar government that you have in this case. It's just unbelievable. I mean, it's almost like, the Israeli political elite was trying to advertise its intention to destroy the Palestinian people. So I don't know how this court, after having granted the relief that was sought by Gambia in the Myanmar case, just 2020, and we're talking about essentially the same judges who are going to make the decision in this case. Okay, it's the same panel. How can they have any credibility? How can their reputations be preserved if, on a stronger set of facts, they reject South Africa's application after having granted it in the Myanmar case? I just think that would be a bridge too far, and I think a majority of the judges are not going to want to go there. But I could be wrong.
Okay. The other question that I have for you, um, regardless of the outcome, has this not been an incredibly effective PR tool against Israel?
Yeah, and I want to be clear in answering your question. When you say PR tool, I interpret that to mean uh, disclosure of the facts, because I don't think that these condemnations that are coming out of South Africa are propaganda in one single respect. They're just telling the truth, and the truth about Israel is told so infrequently in the West that this is absolutely a stunning reversal for Israel's reputation on the international stage. No question about it. And just this morning, before I started speaking to you, Regis, I saw this incredible thing. The Guardian, BBC, and all these other major mainstream, Sky News, CNN, they gave almost no coverage or very little coverage to South Africa's submissions. And then these organizations, certain of them, were live streaming the Israeli response. It's the most ridiculous thing. I mean, of course, if this had been, to come back to a subject you and I like to discuss, the war in Ukraine, if the applicant had been seeking a relief against Russia, you can be sure that all of these mainstream media organizations in the West would have been blaring, as loudly as they could, the details of the submissions being made by the applicant. But in this case, they're trying to bury them. And then this morning, I saw a video. Someone produced a video in which actors from the Game of Thrones and other very well-known American actors, for example, Susan Sarandon, were reading South Africa's submissions. And they're putting this out in a series of videos, and this video has gone viral. So despite the efforts of the West to bury the horrific facts of what is happening in Gaza and also in the West Bank, the public is getting the news. They're getting the news through a variety of means, particularly on social media. Al Jazeera has done absolutely heroic reporting on the ground in Gaza. Lost one journalist after another to murderous Israeli attacks. The families of Al Jazeera's journalists have been attacked and killed. And this is just heightening the public's awareness throughout the West of what is actually happening. So this is an absolute public relations catastrophe for the state of Israel.
Well, I think that's what I really meant. I didn't mean to say that that South Africa was using this for propaganda. Yeah. I really meant the effect of this has given much more attention to a much broader audience than had South Africa not brought this case before the ICJ. I mean, I think in terms of public opinion, Israel has already lost this thing, even without the case being brought to the ICJ. I want to Netanyahu, denouncing the court, says it's got no legitimacy, nothing else. What are your thoughts on Netanyahu and what he's trying to do?
Israel's politicians and defenders have been saying for decades, it's really laughable, that the United Nations is biased against it. This is not new. What they're saying about, the ICJ's illegitimacy and so forth. First of all, when it comes to this particular legal proceeding, let's just bear in mind that Israel is a signatory to the United Nations Charter, and it's a signatory to the Genocide Convention of 1948. It signed up for this. In other words, for being subjected to the jurisdiction and the scrutiny of the International Court of Justice. So it has really no grounds to complain about the fact that it's being hauled before the International Court of Justice to answer for its horrific conduct. But this whole idea that the UN is biased against it, here's the reality. The reality is that the United Nations is primarily responsible for the creation of Israel. I mean, Israel wouldn't exist, I think it's fair to say, without the United Nations having a majority of its member states having supported the creation of Israel. And moreover, the way in which historic Palestine was partitioned at the time of Israel's creation and partitioned under the auspices of the UN was profoundly unfair to the Palestinian people. Even though they constituted a substantial majority of the population, they got a much less than a majority of the territory of historic Palestine. And then, over the years, and this is, Israel always focuses on the resolutions that the UN Security Council and the General Assembly have adopted since, primarily since the occupation began in 1967, in which they've condemned Israel and demanded that Israel comply with international law. It's true there have been a lot of resolutions over the years, but the United Nations has done absolutely nothing to enforce any of them. Israel has thumbed its nose at the United Nations General Assembly and Security Council for decades with total impunity. So when you look at the reality of the relationship between the United Nations and Israel, the idea that the United Nations has been unfair to Israel is, quite frankly, a sick joke. Okay, it's been grotesquely unfair to the Palestinian people. The fact that we're here today, after all of these decades, watching this nightmare unfold, is testimony to the abject failure of the United Nations to hold Israel accountable for its crimes.
Wow, thank you for that. I think that's going to be really informative, valuable information for a lot of people that are listening to this. It's become obvious, not in the mainstream media. I don't know about the United States, but almost nothing in the media here recently has covered these protests that are happening around the world. There was not one mention in today's RT or Sputnik news about the protests going on in Washington, D.C. and around the country and around the world. Millions of people out protesting against Israel, and people talking about boycotts. I really think that's unfortunate from both sides of the Atlantic. I think, I hope that people are going to learn from your own personal experience. And what I want you to share now, you left Canada and you went to Washington, D.C. yesterday for what was supposed to be a massive protest in front of the White House against what Israel is doing in Palestine, but also against the United States government that has been fostering it, been turning a blind eye to it. Tell me a little bit about the protests that you attended in Washington, D.C. yesterday. How big was it? Was it orderly? Was it peaceful? Did the police intervene at all?
I'm standing a few steps away from the White House in Washington, D.C., amongst a truly massive throng that is assembled here today to conduct a rally in support of the Palestinian people. I drove here from Canada last night after watching the historic 2 days of pleadings before the International Court of Justice, the truly inspiring submissions of the South African team, and then learning of the criminally irresponsible escalation of the war in the Middle East by the Biden administration. I decided this was the right place to be at this particular extraordinary moment in human history. Please join this movement.
It was gigantic. I mean, it was impossible for me to give any accurate estimate of how many were there, me alone. I mean, others, if they had had drones, perhaps they could have done something to estimate the size of it. But it was so big that chunks of it were breaking off and walking through the streets of Washington, downtown Washington, around the White House. And there were like independent satellite protests going on all over the place. So there's no way to actually, for just one observer like myself, tell you with reasonable accuracy how many people were out there. But what I can say is this: in the main square where I was situated, I know what 100,000, 80, 90,000 people looks like in a gathering, because I've attended matches, football matches in European stadiums where, which had a capacity of 80, 90,000 people, and it was packed. So I've done that several times. So I know kind of how a crowd of that size looks like. And I can tell you this was bigger for sure. It was unbelievable. I would estimate that there were way over 100,000 people there, and could have been hundreds of thousands of people. And I saw the reports in the mainstream media. There was one in the Guardian where they referred to the number of protesters as thousands. I mean, it's ridiculous. If they were being accurate, they would have said well in excess of 100,000 people. And it was amazing to me that we had so many people. And let me just step back for a second and say, those people have a lot of reason to be angry. Absolutely, they should be furious, and many of them are, because what is happening is that the Biden administration is shipping gigantic amounts of extraordinarily lethal weaponry, like 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs, to Israel as it's committing a genocide. And not only that, the Biden administration is escalating a war in the Middle East, where it has troops situated in hostile territory in flagrant violation of international law, like its military bases in Syria and in Iraq. It was told to get the hell out of Iraq, and it still has military forces there, and it's killing people in Iraq. It's killing people in Syria. It's providing weapons to Israel that Israel is using to kill people in Lebanon, including civilians. And now it's killing people in Yemen. Okay, it's killing people all over the Middle East. And this is on the verge of breaking out into a full-scale regional war, which will have catastrophic consequences for the global economy and affect us all, because of the fact that a major war with Iran is going to basically destroy the ability of oil-producing states in the region to deliver their product to markets around the world. It'll cause the price of oil to soar, undoubtedly, at a time when people are already hurting from inflation. So people have a lot of reason to be angry. And yet I didn't see a single act of violence, Regis. I was out there for 7 hours. I didn't see any vandalism. I didn't see anybody threatened with violence. I didn't see any windows broken. It's remarkable. And despite this, the report, about Palestinian solidarity protests in the West, and this is particularly true in Canada, where I've been to, 24 protests in the last 3 months. I've spoken at several of them. They're suggesting that these people are all violent savages that are going out there, and that they're rampaging through the streets and looking to commit pogroms against members of the Jewish community. These are flagrant lies. It's remarkable how peaceful these people have actually been, and that was definitely true yesterday. Were there police in the streets? There were a lot of police vehicles in the streets, but actual police officers, they for some reason, they seem to be quite content to stay in their vehicles and their vans. But towards the end of the evening, at around 8 p.m., the rally began at 1 p.m. By that point, a lot of people had left. A lot of people came to Washington on buses, so they had to get on the buses and go home wherever they came from. But there was still a sizable crowd at the barrier separating the public from the White House. And that was a little more animated, that crowd. And some of the people there, there's the wrought iron gate that's always gone around the White House, and now they have this other barrier, this metal fence. So they have now 2 barriers around the White House. I don't know that was just for this protest. I think that might be permanent or semi-permanent. But anyways, there were some protesters who were shaking that fence, and they were shouting words like "Intifada" and "Revolution." And there was no violence, though. And at that point, heavily armed riot police lined up between the 2 barriers. So they weren't, face to face with the protesters, but they were now, I would say, 10 meters away from them. And interestingly, somebody, I think some White House, some observer, some pro-Israel observer on social media, this was shown to me while I was actually at the protest last night in front of the White House, said that non-essential personnel had been ordered to leave the White House because of pro-Yemen. That's how they described this, pro-Yemen protesters, on the verge of rampaging at the gates of the White House. And that caused me to quip, well, they must have sent Joe Biden home, because given his mental condition, he certainly qualifies as non-essential personnel nowadays.
All right. We're going to talk about the Houthis in a minute, but now for some time, now this has been going on for 3 months, okay, this large-scale genocide that's underway. People around the world have been boycotting, and groups have been calling for boycotts of Israel products all over the world, which I think has had an effect, and from what I can tell, is having an effect on the Israeli economy. But the biggest thing, the thing that I think may have been unexpected, with these Houthis, these rebels, whatever the Western media wants to call them. They're freedom fighters, is what they are, in my opinion, just like they are in so many other countries around the world, fighting for autonomy, fighting for independence, fighting for self-determination. And yet the United States and its buddies in Ukraine and France have been bombing the heck out of them. The Houthis started firing rockets at ships carrying oil and goods through the Red Sea and then the Suez Canal to Israel. And I'm reading now, and there is coverage of this in the Russian media. It's costing the Israeli economy billions of dollars in not only oil, but food, supplies, whatever else. What are your thoughts on, is this a game changer? The Houthis getting involved in this, and it's almost like if you were looking at a chessboard, somebody moved a pawn that almost called checkmate. I mean, it's not checkmate, but it's a major, in my opinion, a major move. What are your thoughts?
You know, Regis, I got so much to say about this. I don't even know where to begin.
Wherever you want.
Why don't we start by just sort of quickly talking about the economic condition in Israel, which is important context. There was a major report in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago, and it's not just the Post that has been reporting this. The Jerusalem Post and other major organizations and media organizations of the West have said that Israel's economy is reeling. The Washington Post article said that tourism is flatlined, that the construction industry has ground to a halt because apparently it depends very extensively, the Israeli construction industry, on Palestinian workers coming in from the occupied territories, which is basically stopped. That the Israeli economy has been hurt by the fact that hundreds of thousands of people, many of them skilled workers, have been taken out of their jobs and called up for military service. Tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, have been evacuated from border regions around Gaza and the north because of Hezbollah's retaliatory attacks. And those people are being housed. They're internally displaced, and they're being housed at Israeli government expense. And there is a boycott going on. I'll just tell you a little story, which I found very moving. Somebody that I hadn't spoken to in 10 years, who used to live in the part of Canada where I was living at the time and moved to the West, just resurfaced a few weeks ago and sent me a message. And she said she had gone into, she doesn't have a lot of money. She doesn't have a big income. So she tends to, shop at no frills places. And she had gone into some no frills store in Alberta where she now lives. And she saw just ordinary Canadians, low income members of society walking around the store with this app. Somebody's developed an app to help you identify products that you shouldn't buy because they're either being produced out of Israel or they're being produced by companies that are complicit in the oppression of the Palestinian people. And she was like, brought to tears by this, that these poor people were, taking the time out of their lives, their difficult circumstances, to try to identify products that they shouldn't be buying in solidarity with the Palestinian people. So it's a very dire and unsustainable economic situation for Israel already, independently of anything the Houthis do. And now, since then, of course, the maritime traffic, since the Houthis became involved, the maritime traffic through the Red Sea to Israel's port of Eilat has evaporated. I've seen satellite photographs which show that the port of Eilat, which is a major, commercial port for the state of Israel, has basically become a ghost town. There's virtually no activity there. So this is a very serious blow to the Israeli economy. But more so, it's a blow to commercial shipping because if you are insuring one of these vessels, even if there's just a very small chance that the Houthis are going to be able to sink one of these vessels or cause massive damage to it, and so far they haven't done any of those things. They've not sunk any vessel. They haven't done major damage to any vessel. I'm not aware of a single fatality or even a serious injury arising from the Houthi attacks on these commercial ships. But if there's even a small chance that they might be able to sink or seriously damage one of these things, because the cost of these vessels is so high, it costs so much money to replace, the insurance premiums will soar. And that's what's happened. The insurance has soared, not just for, vessels that are bound for Israel, but vessels that are bound for other destinations, which the Houthis have said very clearly that they're not interested in targeting unless these vessels come from countries that are attacking Yemen. And I saw another report that the revenue from the Suez Canal has plummeted by something like 40%, which is a serious, serious matter for the government of Egypt. Depends very critically upon revenue from the Suez Canal for its own budgetary needs. So this is an amazing thing that the Houthis have done with very little firepower. It's a huge embarrassment to the United States. And now we're seeing the United States do predictably what the U.S. government, it's always done, which is lash out with mindless, senseless violence that's going to undoubtedly cause massive suffering to the Yemeni people if it continues for very long. And let's just bear in mind, Regis, that the United States and its proxies in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have caused incalculable suffering to the people of Yemen over the last 8 years. Why? Because there was, internally a revolt against a government that was not meeting the needs of the Yemeni people. It was a revolt led by the Houthis. It was a government that was effectively a pawn of the Saudi monarchy. That government, I understand its officials are now living in some posh hotel in Saudi Arabia, waiting for the day when they will be restored to power. And that day looks further away than ever, because this is actually causing, I think, a huge number of Yemenis to rally around the leadership of the Houthi movement. You see these photos coming out of Yemen of these protests in support of the government and the Palestinian people. They are of mind-boggling size, bigger than any protests I've ever seen. And these people are suffering incredible privation. Until Gaza, Yemen was the site of the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe for a number of years because of the Saudi-led and U.S.-backed attacks on the Yemeni people. And now, they're suffering enormously even before the bombardment by the British and the Americans began. But the Gaza is even worse. Gaza has displaced Yemen as the site of the worst humanitarian catastrophe on earth.
Yeah. I have another question to ask you about Israel's future. It appears to me that Israel now has become a pariah in the eyes of the rest of the world, except for the United States and a handful of its piglets, its vassals. You mentioned earlier that even the creation of Israel, aided by the United Nations, was actually illegal. Do you see in the future that Israel, because of all of this, might cease to exist as an independent state?
So you and I have talked about, we had a long conversation about, 2 articles that I wrote where I said that Israel is hurtling towards a strategic defeat. I think that you and I had that conversation about 2 months ago. I am more convinced than ever that Israel's toast. They're finished. And it's just a question of what this new state is going to look like. But the old Israel's gone and ain't coming back. It is a pariah. Even if the if the ICJ doesn't rule against Israel, all that's going to do is put a nail in the coffin of whatever credibility the United Nations system had up until now. It isn't going to save Israel. I mean, people can see with their own eyes what Israel is doing, and there's no question that it's committing a genocide. And even if you can construct some clever argument that it doesn't quite meet the definition of genocide, for sure it's committing heinous war crimes and crimes against humanity. Everybody can see this. And the way Israel's leaders have responded by this is doubling down on their depravity and openly declaring, thumbing their nose at everybody, accusing the United Nations of being anti-Semitic, declaring they're going to wipe out Gaza, kill its children, and on and on and on. It's just horrific, and people can see it. So reputationally, Israel is finished. Economically, I can't see Israel recovering. There are a lot of people who aren't going to want to come back. Hundreds of thousands have left the country. They're not going to want to come back. The notion that Israelis are secure has been blown sky high. The economy is crippled currently and is never going to fully recover, in my opinion. Militarily, the idea that Israel is one of the most powerful forces on earth has been made a laughing stock. After 3 months of the amount of munitions they've dropped on Gaza is well in excess now of the explosive power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And you're talking about a very small enclave that is one of the most densely populated parts of the world. And Hamas continues every day to inflict significant casualties on Israeli forces in Gaza. The Israelis have been completely incapable of pushing Hezbollah away from the border. And, Israel's military budget, along with the $3.8 billion a year in military assistance it receives from the United States, is vastly in excess of the military spending, whatever it may be, of Hezbollah and Hamas put together. And yet they're nowhere close to having defeated either of them. So how is Israel going to recover from this? It's not. And there are basically two scenarios, in my opinion, in Israel's future. One scenario is that that the occupied territories become formally incorporated into what is now the state of Israel, and that everybody is given a right to vote in the elections of that state, which means that, the anti-Palestinian segment of Jewish Israeli society will no longer be able to dominate at the polls the Palestinian population. And it's going to become more of a Palestinian state than a Jewish state. That's one scenario. The other scenario is that Israel is going to have to finally submit to the demands of the United Nations and give the Palestinian people a sovereign state that is more or less along the 1967 borders, which, by the way, would be an absolutely fantastic deal for Israel. Israel has rejected this over and over again. It has basically made that two-state solution, which the UN Security Council has demanded for decades, a practical impossibility, because there's now settlements all over the West Bank, and there's some 700,000 or more Israeli Jewish citizens living in those Jewish-only settlements. Is Israel going to evacuate them all? And, especially the ones who are armed and fanatical, as most of them are? Maybe, but it's difficult to imagine it doing that or even being able to do that at this stage, which means you're looking at a one-state solution. I don't even know if this state's going to be called Israel. It might actually, at some point in the near future, undergo a name change and become Palestine. And what is then going to happen, if there is in fact a single state created, and even actually if they manage somehow miraculously to implement the two-state solution despite all of those settlements, I think what's going to happen is that a lot of Jewish Israeli citizens are going to leave the country. Because frankly, in the Jewish Israeli society, there are heroic exceptions to this rule. But by and large, the population is intensely anti-Palestinian. And I can't imagine that a lot of those people, because of their virulent hatred of Palestinians and distrust of Palestinians, are going to be willing to live side by side with them, either in a two-state scenario or a single state where everybody has equal rights, which I think is very sad. I think it's entirely possible for Palestinians and Jews to coexist in one country all over the place. I mean, we do that, in every Western country. There are Palestinians and Jews coexisting, in a situation where they both have equal rights to vote, to democratic participation. There's no reason why this can't happen in historic Palestine. But, the population in Israel has been so, beset with a racist animus towards the Palestinians that I think a lot of people are ultimately going to leave Israel once this one of these two scenarios unfolds. And then you're just going to have a state that's overwhelmingly majority Palestinian.
Okay, last question. In the short term, where do you think this is headed?
We're heading to a major regional war. I mean, I just can't see how that's how we're going to avoid that. And there's one reason and one reason only why this is going to happen, and that is because the Biden administration is going to make it happen. They're going to make it happen. I mean, look at this ridiculous, idiotic, insane response that they've had to the Houthi the quite dramatic and admirable attempts by the Houthis to actually stop the genocide in Gaza without, as I mentioned, without causing a single fatality amongst those, the passengers and the sailors of those commercial vessels going through the Red Sea. The response, if they were rational, if they were humane, of the Biden administration would have been to do what the Houthis and the world have been demanding and stop Israel from committing a genocide in Gaza, which Biden could do at any time. He just has to call up Netanyahu and say, that's it, the gig's up, we're not sending any more weapons unless and until you stop. And you have to allow in the necessary humanitarian aid. And Biden could also force Israel to implement the two-state solution. I have no doubt he could, because Israel could never survive in its current form without massive support from the United States. It would have no alternative. But rather than do that, and this would have restored commercial shipping to the Red Sea immediately, the humane solution, the legal solution, what does he do? He launches another savage bombardment of Yemen, which has already been racked with suffering for 8 years because of American policy in the Middle East. So, the Houthis aren't backing down. I mean, these people, if they survived what they endured over the last 8 years, there's absolutely no prospect of them stopping now because yet more bombs are being dropped upon them by the United States or one of its proxies. And then we're going to, eventually we continue down this path. There's going to be a full-blown war with Iran, and that's going to cause mass. I talked about the implications for the global economy of that. But the United States is going to take some horrific casualties if and when we end up in that place, because the Iranians have extraordinarily effective missile capacity, anti-ship missiles, ballistic missiles, unlike anything that the Israelis and the Americans have had to confront in the Middle East up until now. And they will use them. And they've been preparing for this battle for decades. And I think they're going to be sinking, naval vessels, major naval vessels in the Middle East, in the Gulf, and so forth. The American military personnel, they're going to take very significant casualties if we get to that point of escalation. And Israel itself could get completely flattened by the ballistic missiles of Iran. Certainly, it's going to take enormous damage, unlike any damage that Israel has suffered before. That's where we're heading. Hopefully, Regis, somebody in the Biden administration is going to come to their senses and stop this travesty before we end up in a place of real pain and suffering for the whole world, frankly, but particularly for the peoples of the Middle East.
I just thought of one more question before we conclude. I saw one article, an analysis of China and Russia in terms of having any influence in this particular crisis. Do you have any concluding thoughts on China's role, Russia's role?
Well, it's interesting. The day of the commencement of the bombardment. And by the way, I just want to note, this is another sort of indication of the fact that there are no adults in the room in the White House. Okay, when did they start bombing Yemen? They started bombing Yemen within hours of South Africa completing its powerful and compelling submissions at the International Court of Justice on Thursday of last week. Anybody who thinks that that's coincidental, I have some swampland in Florida you might be interested in. Okay, there's no way that was coincidental. They did it then at a bare minimum to distract the world's attention from what South Africa had told the International Court of Justice, but also perhaps to send a message, which is, just sort of thumbing its nose at the international legal architecture. But in any event, just before they started the bombing on Thursday, there was a vote at the United Nations Security Council on a resolution which basically demanded, it didn't authorize anybody to bomb Yemen. There's nothing in there about bombing Yemen, but it did demand that the Houthis stop attacking commercial vessels in the straits off of its coast. And interestingly, Russia, China, Algeria, and one other country, I believe it might have been Namibia, it was an African state, abstained. They didn't veto it, but they abstained, which I think is quite interesting because I couldn't see Russia or China vetoing that resolution because they do have a very powerful interest in, commercial shipping lanes remaining open. I mean, those two countries, especially China, major exporters They don't want to see, a maritime passage that is extremely important to world commerce being shut down. But the fact that they didn't vote for the resolution was quite interesting. The Chinese and the Russians have very close relations with Iran. The Chinese, I think it was a couple of years ago, they negotiated what they called a strategic economic deal with the Iranian government, involving hundreds of billions of dollars of commerce. The Russians have, close military cooperation with Iran, in addition to close commercial ties and growing commercial ties. Iran was just admitted to the BRICS. So if the United States starts pummeling Iran with bombs, I wouldn't exclude the possibility that China and Russia somehow become involved in this. It'd be very hard at that stage for both of them to remain out of the conflict. And then we're in real trouble, Regis. I mean, we narrowly escaped a nuclear war in Ukraine over the last 2 years. It seems like the Biden administration is hell-bent on causing one, frankly.